Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the second part of my conversation with Robert Saunders. Last time, we talked about Winston Churchill's 1946 speech, the Iron Curtain speech, and his understanding of Britain, America, and the wider world. Today, we're looking backwards and forwards from that date, across 200 years of the Anglo-American relationship, the so-called special relationship. What has America been to Britain? An inspiration, an ally, a rival, a threat? Are they us? Are we them? Or are we and they something completely different? Robert, in our last episode, we talked about a speech given by Winston Churchill in 1946 that for many people is a sort of embodiment almost of the UK-US relationship, sometimes in the cliche called the special relationship. It clearly was a very significant moment in that relationship, and it's come to shape some people's imagination of what came next. And as we discussed, Churchill had a very particular vision of just how close, in general, the English-speaking peoples, but in particular, these two nations founded on the same principles, the same ideals of democracy, freedom, the rule of law, and so on, should be bound together. He treated them as natural allies, potentially future members of a state in which all of their citizens had a shared citizenship. I mean, he had a vision of something that went beyond what has ever existed in the history of the relationship of these two nations. I hinted that this view is not always the one that people have had of this relationship, and that there's something anomalous and distinctly Churchillian about it, but it has really shaped the subsequent imagination of it to the point that here in 2026, where people think that something is coming to an end, we're speaking on a day in which Keir Starmer in Parliament has been questioned once again about whether he's just torn up the special relationship. And he replied that he didn't think the special relationship depended on waiting to see what Donald Trump says next. But there is a view that something established, maybe the default in this relationship, is coming to an end now. So this is a conversation about what really is the default in that relationship. Actually, is there any default in that relationship? Because particularly seen from the UK, people have had very different ideas and understandings of what America represents, what it represents in relation to Britain, whether we do indeed share more than divides us. And we're going to do a whistle-stop tour, not of one speech and 1 year, but of more than 200 years, because I'm really curious to get a sense from you of where you think the central dynamic in this relationship historically has lain, and to what extent 2026 is or isn't an outlier. So I'm going to ask you a very big question, and you can answer it in any way you like. In the first half of the 19th century, which is a long time, do you think in general, when politicians, writers, public figures, but also ordinary Britons, looked at the United States, they saw a natural ally? Or did they see a rival? Or did they see something else? Did they see a mad experiment in democracy? How do you think people saw it back then?
I think they look at it with a mixture of inspiration and trepidation. So on the one hand, this is a nation that is forged in war against Great Britain. It quickly becomes an economic rival and an imperial rival. Britain goes to war with the United States in 1812, and war is always a possibility, actually, for the rest of the 19th century. But alongside that, there is an absolutely magnetic fascination with America that we don't really find for any other country in the 19th century. Britain in the 19th century is often seen as a little bit intellectually insular. There's a sense that Britain is the freest, the most powerful, and most prosperous nation in the world, and it doesn't have a great deal to learn from other countries. But America is the country to which novelists, philosophers, politicians, journalists do consistently turn, and about which they're consistently writing and thinking. And I think there are probably three main reasons for that. The first is that America is seen as representing an extraordinary social and political experiment. It is trying to create a democracy, in their sense of that term, in a complex modern society on a continental scale. So we tend to assume that democracy in the 19th century is a futurist idea. It is something towards which nations are moving. Actually, for most Victorians, democracy is a backward-looking idea. It is something that is found in the ancient world, in small city-states in Greece and in Rome. So the idea that you can create a democracy across a continental landmass with all the complexities of the modern world, covering millions of people, that is an experiment. And there is a magnetic fascination with how that experiment is going to go. Secondly, that experiment is being conducted by people who are largely descended from English settlers. And at a time when race is considered very important in political thought, this might give you a sense of what democracy looks like when worked by Englishmen. And then thirdly, that state has been born out of rebellion against the British Empire. So this is a living example of how empires are lost. So later in the 19th century, when Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa are reaching similar levels of social and political and economic maturity, this is the great cloud that hangs overhead. This is the fate that must be avoided. So in terms of its democracy, in terms of its racial character, and in terms of its imperial destiny, this has a place in British political thought that no other country can match.
But on the racial question, it is also the case that this is a slave-owning nation, at least in part, and its constitution explicitly acknowledges the fact that slavery is part of the American establishment. And so, just to take one example, there were many. For some of those British writers and thinkers who were magnetically drawn to the United States, one was Charles Dickens, absolutely obsessed with America in some respects. He went there. Many things happened to him while he was there, but to sum it up, the brute fact of slavery was so abhorrent to him that in a way he turned. So to what extent did that then cloud this fascination, possible inspiration, but also, as you say, trepidation? There is something else going on here, which Britain, which obviously was once a slave-owning nation too, had seen itself self-consciously move away from. And yet here is this nation, which is a democracy, made up of English settlers, with whom Great Britain still has profound ties of history and allegiance, potentially at least, shared heritage. Does slavery fundamentally cloud that?
Yes, slavery is a massive problem for anyone who admires the United States, particularly because in the first half of the 19th century, the people who most naturally admire the United States are political radicals. They're people who want to extend the vote. They're nonconformists. They're religious radicals who admire the religious freedom of the United States. And yet here is a society built on slavery. The big question, therefore, is why does slavery endure? Why is America a slave society? Is this simply the last relic of kingly dominion? Is this the last grisly inheritance of the British Empire, the thing that stops America being fully a democracy? Or is this actually what makes democracy possible? Because those same people whose idea of democracy is drawn from the ancient world know that those ancient societies were themselves slave states. It was commonly argued that one reason why a city-state can be a democracy, in which the citizens all gather in the town square and decide public affairs, is because slaves are all doing the actual work. So there's a conservative take on America, which says you can operate democracy in America because the poorest are not actually wielding political power. If you applied that model to the United Kingdom, then the agricultural labourer, the factory worker, they would hold political power, and you would actually have a much more radical and much more dangerous political state.
And did this then morph into a view which actually means that we're talking about two Americas here? Because I've asked you in broad terms about the first half of the 19th century, and then comes the Great Schism of the Civil War. And again, people in Britain were horrified, fascinated, drawn to and repulsed from the Civil War. Here is a state conducting this great experiment, which has fallen into the worst fate that can befall a state from the ancient world onwards. There did in the Civil War clearly seem to be two Americas. Seen from Britain, is it possible to characterize how people drew the morality lesson from the falling of this state into civil war?
There's a bit of a myth that the British responded to the Civil War by dancing in the streets. There was great exultation at this braggart democracy being brought low, this imperial rival having its power broken. And of course, there are some examples of that. But actually, by and large, there is real anguish in Britain, actually, at what appears to be the failure of this political experiment. There are also very severe economic consequences. Britain's biggest industry in the 1860s is textiles. Its raw material comes from the American South, and the cutting off of that supply by the Northern blockade actually reduces much of Lancashire to severe economic distress. So the Civil War is an important event in Britain as well as in the United States. There's then the question of what lessons do you learn from the Civil War? It's quite a widespread view that the war represents a failure of the American Constitution, that in a society that is divided on questions like slavery, tariffs, states' rights, this democratic constitution has not been able to do what constitutions exist in order to do, which is to give you a peaceful way of resolving things that we care about and disagree about very passionately. And there had, for a long time, been a conservative argument that democracy only worked in the United States because it had certain propitious circumstances. There were certain special conditions in the United States that didn't apply in Europe. And those are principally things like the extraordinary availability of land, which reduces the pressure on politics, it reduces economic pressure, and it means that everyone can sort of become a property owner. And it had long been predicted in Britain that as America industrialized and as America urbanized, and as it started to look more like a modern European state, actually its democracy would break under that strain. So one reading of the American Civil War is actually to see that vindicated, to think that the Civil War has proven that democracy cannot work in a complex modern society.
And people were conflicted as well as to which side they wanted to win. I mean, that is also true. It's not simply the case that the North were the good guys and the South were the bad guys, as seen from Britain. And indeed, some of the alliances across the Atlantic during this period are quite surprising, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that the sympathies of the British public, and actually most of its political system, are usually with the North. And that's partly because they knew the North much better. You spoke earlier about the sense there are two Americas. The North of America is just much easier to visit and get around. There are much better connections between things like the newspaper industries of the North and the United Kingdom. Travellers who do go to the American South are often quite revolted, not just by the slave society, but actually also by what they see as a sort of fake, rather pompous ersatz aristocracy, which they don't recognise as the aristocracy of their own country. What there is, however, is quite a widespread lack of belief that the South can be brought back into the Union. So it's quite a common view to say this is a catastrophe, but what's going to happen now is that Americans are going to kill each other on an unprecedented scale, and at the end of it, the Confederacy will survive. So pressure for peace tends to be predicated more on the assumption that the war can't be won than on the idea that the South ought to win. Now, the fact that the North does win, of course, challenges that, and in long term, it challenges some ideas about American democracy. But in the short term, its effect is fairly muted in the sense that it proves that democracies can win wars, but it doesn't prove that democracy can do what it had failed to do in 1861, which is to take an intensely divided society made up of people who have spent 4 years killing each other and bring that back into a self-governing, free federation. The British, of course, have their own memories of civil war. This is a culture steeped in the memory of the 17th century. They know that civil wars can start up again. They know that in the aftermath of a civil war, you can have military strongmen who take power. There are lots of comparisons drawn between Oliver Cromwell and someone like Ulysses S. Grant, who's starting his rise towards the presidency. There's a lot of interest in the battle between the Rump Congress and President Johnson, and the kind of battles that you get between the Rump Parliament and Oliver Cromwell. So the question of whether democracy can win in war seems to have been settled in 1865. The question of whether it can endure in peace is still very much open.
And as you said, for some conservatives at least, America is a genuine democracy, but also a fake democracy in the sense it's a genuine classical democracy, but it's a fake modern democracy, because it certainly doesn't enfranchise all of its inhabitants. It's a slave-owning society. After 1865, in the first phase of Reconstruction, the United States does now move to a new kind of experiment, which is the possibility, at least, in theory, though not eventually in practice, of the enfranchisement of all of its inhabitants, including those who had once been slaves. So, seen from Britain, is this going to be the decisive experiment? Now, finally, we have a state that has not completed its expansion, but has largely completed its continental expansion, which has been industrialized, and it is the industrial bit that has won, and is now embarking on an experiment where it is going to democratize the South. It is a failed experiment in the sense that that phase of Reconstruction does not last long, and within a couple of decades, the South has been allowed not to return to slavery, but to return to effective disenfranchisement of its poorest inhabitants. So when seen from Britain, from here, what is the lesson then of the second half of the 19th century version of the experiment? Because on one account, this looks like the real experiment now. Now we are doing it in terms where this is looking more like a society like Britain. And yet the assumption beforehand that it wouldn't work, you might say, is confirmed by what's happened in the later decades of the 19th century.
British visitors to America and commentators on American politics had always been very struck by the power of party in America and its ability to operate what was described as machine politics in a way that controls large numbers of voters. That's been a feature of British commentary throughout the 19th century, and in a sense it ramps up in the aftermath of the Civil War. There's a lot of interest in gerrymandering, there's a lot of interest in vote rigging, the effective exclusion of large parts of the black population in the South, and the way that certain kinds of political bosses seem to run the big cities. There's a real sensation around the presidential election of 1876, when it at least appears to British observers that the presidency has been stolen by the Republican Party from the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden, who had himself been a campaigner against corruption. There's in particular a lot of interest in New York, and that's partly just because New York is accessible. It's the place where you land when you go to the United States. It's the easiest place to get newspapers from. So there's lots of interest in the corruption and the Tammany Hall politics of somewhere like New York. But there's also a kind of intellectual reason for that interest, which is that in many ways, New York looks like a European city. It's a very densely crowded and populated city. It's got very high levels of immigration. It's got extreme disparities between the rich and the poor. And so critics of democracy will often say, if you actually want to know what democracy would look like in a European city, New York is where you should look. And New York is the place where you find corruption at its most extreme. So there is one reading of democracy after the Civil War that says, actually, what this gives us in its purest form is the politics of Gotham. And that's not what we want over in Britain.
And was there a view that the Constitution, which survived the Civil War in one sense, but also, as you say, looked at from the outside, seemed to have been discredited by the Civil War, that America's constitutional arrangements were things to be emulated or admired? I mean, there have always been people who, from the dawn of the Constitution, who have seen in it at least an attempt to elaborate in a concise but workable form a separation of powers, a set of institutions that are designed to guard against the extremes of mobocracy and that vision of democracy, which is it's just going to be ruled by the poor. We call it democracy, as you say, for Europeans. This was seen as the great democratic experiment, but it was, in its own terms, self-consciously a republic, and it was a republic with all sorts of safeguards in it. So some of these safeguards produce failure, including the failure of the Civil War. It's not able to accommodate conflict. But as we move through the 19th century, are people in Britain looking at the United States and thinking the lesson to be learned here is not the democratic lesson, it's the constitutional lesson?
Yes, there are all sorts of ways in which Reconstruction fails, but it succeeds in one essential element, which is that it does actually rebuild the United States as a self-governing entity. It is able to incorporate the South, in however flawed a form, back into its republican institutions. And that is something that does challenge the idea that democracy can't actually hold together a complex, divided society. But probably more important than that is that we do start to see something remarkable from about the late 1870s onwards, which is a growing conservative admiration for democracy in America. Because America hasn't just rebuilt its democracy, it seems to have avoided some of the problems that are plaguing Europe. Its taxes are pretty low. It has a very capitalist culture. It's not particularly a home to socialist politics. It's respectful of private property. And as you've said, crucially, it seems to have all sorts of checks and balances on democracy, which a country like the United Kingdom actually increasingly lacks. So we recorded some episodes recently about Home Rule in Ireland and Gladstone's attempt to give Ireland self-government in the 1880s. A lot of unionists in Britain are saying, well, hang on, America showed us that a democracy fights to hold its union together. And if you wanted to make Texas or Alabama self-governing, you couldn't just pass an act of parliament. You would have to go through a really difficult process of constitutional amendment. If democracy is like a flood, America seems to have all sorts of banks and defences and dikes, whereas increasingly the British constitution looks like it's all sails and no anchor. So increasingly we find conservative politicians in Britain actually saying, if we're going to be a democracy, and it's fairly clear by that stage that we are going to be a democracy, America is becoming a beacon of a different kind, in that it shows us what a conservative democracy might look like and how we can erect safeguards against the temporary passions of a democratic electorate.
So, as you say, because Britain is itself democratising at this point, it's democratising in a different way. It's democratising in a piecemeal way through a series of reform acts. It's not yet reached levels of enfranchisement that already exist in the United States. But was there a view that with the democratisation of Britain, Britain was being Americanised? So the Conservative view might be actually the lesson to learn here is that American democracy has within it the safeguards against the thing that we risk bringing on ourselves in Europe. But for the supporters of this new democracy, for the people, including the radicals, not the revolutionaries, but the democratic radicals, was there a view that America was still the model, that the Americanization of British life was something to be encouraged and celebrated? Or was there a feeling by, say, the 1880s that these two democracies were on different paths?
Well, Victorians tended to start from the assumption that every country required different political institutions, and that the same political institutions would be worked differently by different national characters and in different contexts. So I don't think anybody thinks that a British democracy is ever going to look exactly like an American democracy, but you can look at it and see it as a kind of a set of possible futures. And so just as conservatives are starting to think, well, perhaps there are things here that we can imitate, radicals increasingly are starting to think there are things here that we need to avoid. It's already a theme of British commentary on American democracy that this is a system in which money holds extraordinary power, that this is what Gladstone calls a plutocracy working on a democracy, and that that's something you need to avoid. There is severe anxiety about the strength of the party machines in the United States and the difficulty of running candidates from outside the party system. There's a long-standing concern over the 19th century that American democracy produces small politicians and inadequate political leaders. There's a great reverence for the founding fathers, but you then get a sequence of pretty undistinguished presidents up until Abraham Lincoln, and a series of not particularly distinguished presidents that follow him. And there's a time when, in British politics, you can say whatever you think of our leaders, these are big people. Gladstone, Disraeli, Lord Palmerston, Lord Salisbury. The United States doesn't seem to be producing that same quality of leadership. Now, someone like John Stuart Mill would say, well, that's because American politics doesn't really need exceptional leaders. Its tasks are not those of British politics. Talented people are more likely to go into things like merchant shipping or banking or the economy. But it is a concern that if you see Britain as being involved in a kind of competition among nations in the 20th century to uphold its status, are you going to end up with a politics that is in the pockets of the rich and it produces smaller politicians? Or can you be a democracy that doesn't look quite like the United States?
And if it is going to be a competition among nations, that John Stuart Mill assumption that America doesn't have the same scale of obligations and responsibilities and indeed problems as the great European powers, is there a point at which you can see that starting to shift? So you've got Lincoln in the middle of this story, bunch of nobodies before that, a relative bunch of nobodies after that. But by the time you get to McKinley, say, at the end of the 19th century, the beginnings of American imperial ambition, the war with Spain, the colonization of the Philippines and elsewhere, a recognition that American wealth, which may be corrupting its democracy, is also giving it quite a lot of international clout. Is there a point at which this interesting experiment, this useful model from which we can draw lessons, but it's an ocean away, it's its own thing, it has very special conditions, it's not interfering in our part of the world. Is there a point at which a sense of rivalry starts to really kick in?
Yes, there are always two strands, I think, in tension here. So, on the one hand, there's always a strand of British politics that actually does want to draw America out, that wants America to take on certain tasks in its part of the world. So, in the 1820s, we have somebody like George Canning boasting that he has called the new world into existence to redress the balance of the old. He sees himself as a kind of sponsor of the Monroe Doctrine, which seals off the American sphere from the European colonial powers, because that's actually quite a good deal for Britain, given the power of British trade. Or we could fast forward to the 1890s, when Rudyard Kipling is writing dreadful ditties like The White Man's Burden, which I think he publishes in 1899, saying, "Come on, America, step up and do what we're doing in the world." But there's also a recognition that there is a tremendous latent power here, whose interests are not those of the United Kingdom, and which is always, in a sense, going to be an imperial rival. And we talked briefly earlier about the sense that war is always a possibility between Britain and the United States in the 19th century. There is a particular point in the middle of the US Civil War when it looks very like Britain might actually intervene, because British ships have been boarded by Northern forces, breaching the sanctity of the flag. And there is a real horror, actually, in the British press and in British public debate about this possibility, because nobody thinks that war with the United States is going to be easy. There is a recognition that America may not be a great power in a normal sense of the term, but that when it wishes to flex its muscles, as the North does in the 1860s, its power is going to be extraordinary. So Britain wants America to be active in the world, but it is also very wary of that power. And that's partly why the kind of rhetoric that we talked about in the last episode, to which Churchill is so drawn, the idea there is some kind of fraternity of peoples here, that the English-speaking peoples, in fact, can just kind of get on by virtue of certain shared fundamental principles, has such an allure, because it becomes a way of smoothing over the problematic position of American power in British thought.
At the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, Britain has its traditional enemy, France, but there is going to be an entente cordiale. And Britain is facing two rising powers, Germany and the United States. And I remember reading about this period and being struck, somewhat amazed because I didn't know it well, the extent to which there's a feeling that war is coming, but it's quite hard to say whether it's going to be with the Americans or with the Germans, because it was seemed to be a comparable kind of threat. A rising power, a new kind of imperial power. These were nations that seemed to be developing substantial empires. They were industrializing in ways that might be leaving British industry behind. They might be creating powerful navies to rival the British Navy. And during the first decade of the 20th century, I'm not saying it was sort of evenly balanced between the two, if you had to put your money on it, which way is war going to go? But it was an open possibility. British power was being challenged by rising powers, and there were two in particular to be worried about. When in 1914 war comes, is that the moment that changes it? Oh, look, it's with the Germans, but the Americans sit it out. Does it change in 1917 when the Americans join in? Or does it change in 1918 when Britain realizes that this war has been won, but the real victor is the United States? After all, Woodrow Wilson, it's one of the most extraordinary political arcs in the history of the modern world. Woodrow Wilson goes from being the man who kept America out of the war to being the king of the world in the space of 2 years. He arrived in Europe in late 1918 as the sort of democratic titan the world had never seen before. So 1914 to 18 is clearly the key period in the shift in the attitude to the United States. In that respect, this is not simply we have a special interest in relationship with this nation, but it's also a rival to us, to something different. But could you say where you think the decisive shift happens?
So I think there's a shift that happens a little bit earlier, which is important, which is a shift from what we might think of as an age of impunity to an age of anxiety. So it's not an accident that the pinnacle of British power in the late 19th century comes at a point at which almost all of the other potential rivals are off the map for some reason. So the United States has been riven by civil war in the 1860s and is then consumed by Reconstruction. The Russian Empire is defeated in the Crimean War and is then going through all sorts of inner turmoil. France is defeated by Prussia. Prussia and the new Germany is not, for a certain period of time, a threat to areas of particular British interest. So Britain has this unique period in which it is almost a kind of unipolar world, rather like perhaps the world of the late 1990s or the early 2000s. By the early 1900s, it's clear that world is gone, that America is now establishing itself as the engine of the world economy. Germany is now the engine of Europe. France is rebuilding and is looking to compensate its losses to some extent around the Mediterranean and in North Africa. So Britain is horribly overextended because Britain is vulnerable in every part of the world. Wherever a new power is rising, it is probably going to increase its share of the world pie by taking from Britain. So this is a particularly difficult and dangerous period for Britain. I think the structurally important thing with the United States is that when it comes down to it, what matters most to Britain is Europe and India. And the United States is not a threat to either of those things. The United States is not particularly interested in India, and to some extent its interests align with Britain's in terms of Europe. So when the war breaks out in 1914, there's almost immediately a great effort to send politicians, poets, priests, novelists, even women's suffrage campaigners across to the United States to make the case. I don't think there's any sense that the United States is going to come in on the wrong side, realistically. The question is whether it's going to sit it out or whether it can actually be drawn in Britain's support.
And when it is drawn in, is there a point where the British state, the British establishment, the British political imagination has a kind of be careful what you wish for moment? Because the nation that was drawn into this war does emerge from that war, not just as the creditor to the world, because American money is one of the things that funds the war, but it is, to an extraordinary extent, and for a very brief time, the place to which the whole world is looking for inspiration. I mean, the biggest shift that happens from 1917 to 1918, alongside the Russian Revolution, is the extent to which this one man, an American president, we said they've all been pretty undistinguished. And I would have thought even until 1916, most people would have looked at Woodrow Wilson and thought, just another one of the slightly odd people who gets elected president of the United States. He used to run Princeton University and now he's president. Well, what a quaint system they have over there. By 1918, it is his vision of a new world order that has captured the imagination of pretty much the whole world. And his arrival in Europe for the Paris Peace Conference, I've read the newspapers. I've seen the coverage, some of the footage, the early footage of it. It is extraordinary the extent to which an American president, not only can he no longer be treated as a joke, this is the man to whom the whole world is looking. And it's not that Britain has become irrelevant. Of course, Britain hasn't become irrelevant. But suddenly, though Britain has won this war, its place in the world does look different.
I think a recurring feature of the debate around the special relationship is it worse to have America throwing its weight around in the world or to have America not playing its proper role in the world? And British attitudes tend to oscillate between these two extremes. So there is a considerable degree of annoyance with Woodrow Wilson in 1918, 1919. There is an even greater degree of annoyance when actually the United States decides that it doesn't particularly want to play a leading world role in the years that follow. And there is quite a strong sense in Britain in the 20s and increasingly in the 30s that actually it's not that Britain is in denial about its decline, it's that America is in denial about its rise, that it is not stepping up to its role as the guarantor of world security, or indeed the guarantor of the world economy. The fact that the United States doesn't join the League of Nations is a really serious blow to people who want to build a different kind of world order so that the First World War never actually happens again.
And is it a kind of dependency, do you think, at this point? I mean, is there a sense before 1945, 1946, which we talked about last time. Churchill absolutely determined not to present this as a relationship of dependency, and yet giving some clues in the way that he framed it, that he understood some of the realities of this. But before then, is there beginning to be a suspicion, do you think, among British politicians that it's not simply they can look to America for help, for inspiration, to expand their political imaginations, for morality lessons, for warnings about the pitfalls of some political strategies they might choose to adopt, but actually they are in now a relationship in which they are dependent on American power and American wealth. Does that dawn before 1940? Because I think it has dawned by 1940, 41.
Well, we've still got a political class in this period that is largely trained in the classics. And so they often think about world power through models that they've drawn from the ancient world. And in that sense, there's always been a recognition that at some point Britain's power will pass, that empires do fall. They're trained in the history of the fall of the Roman Empire. And one potential model in which you can find some hope is the sort of model of Greece ceding power to Rome. The idea that Rome becomes the somewhat less cultured and less civilized and rather more uncouth power in the world, but that Greece or Britain, through its erudition and its learning and its deep wisdom and experience, can in a sense guide this new Titan. And that's an idea, of course, that is associated with Harold Macmillan later in the 20th century, but it is there in the 1930s. And to some extent, it does become a comforting myth because Britain's position in the 1930s is actually increasingly desperate. Appeasement doesn't happen because of some terrible failure of will on the part of the British establishment. It doesn't happen because Neville Chamberlain is a cowardly man. It happens because Britain is desperately overextended across the world. The rise of Italy is a threat to British interests in the Mediterranean. The rise of Japan is a terrible threat to Britain's empire in the East. The expansion of Nazi Germany is a threat to British interests on the continent. And it is an absolute axiom of British policy throughout the 1930s that Britain cannot fight all of them at the same time. So it either has to shut down certain arenas of conflict or it has to find itself additional allies. And the United States is somewhere that you can look for both of those things. On the one hand, you might be able to get the United States to take over some of the policing of the Pacific world, which eases the pressure against Japan. Or you might, as in the First World War, be able to rely on this as an ally in a battle in Europe.
You described America as the Rome, somewhat culturally uncouth. And I think throughout the 19th century, the fascination with America doesn't really include at all fascination with American culture. Indeed, there is astonishing condescension. The idea that the words culture and the United States might go together would have seemed ridiculous to most Europeans. When I was a child, American culture was everything. I took it for granted that the fascination of the world was with the cultural products of the United States because it was the age of television. But before the age of television, we are, by the time we're in the 20th century, in the age of Hollywood, early Hollywood, before the Second World War, but nonetheless Hollywood. We are in the age of some American writers starting to be taken pretty seriously. The fascination with America includes a fascination with people like Scott Fitzgerald or Hemingway and others, American writers giving a sense of their understanding of America. In Britain, cultural condescension dies hard. Do you think it had begun to waver before the post-Second World War era? Was there still, in the 1920s and 1930s, a thought that we need these people? These people have astonishing amounts of power, quite extraordinary amounts of wealth. We might marry our aristocrats off to the daughters of the industrialists. There's a Henry James version of this. But there's something else going on in America too, that actually this isn't just money power and political power. This might be the beginnings of cultural power as well? Or is that really a post-Second World War story?
I think it's more a post-Second World War story, but if we take an iconic novelist of the interwar period, who's often seen as perhaps the most British novelist you can imagine, it would be P.G. Wodehouse, with his stories about Jeeves and Worcester or Blandings Castle. And it's striking how much of the language in those novels actually is drawn from the United States. Bertie Wooster spends a lot of time in the United States. This sort of very comic style, the sort of jokes that are told, the nicknames that are given to people, a lot of this is actually from the United States. So P.G. Wodehouse is quite an interesting example of a kind of very English figure who is remaking English culture in a form that is saturated by, and therefore very marketable to, American audiences.
And then there are also people, P.G. Wodehouse went to school with Raymond Chandler, and Raymond Chandler becomes a version of American writing that's then imported back to Europe. But perhaps the most striking example of all, the most famous person in the world in 1916, 17, 18 was not the Kaiser, and it wasn't Woodrow Wilson, and it wasn't Lloyd George, it was Charlie Chaplin. And we also are at the beginning now of British people who have moved to the United States exporting back what is American culture, including Hollywood culture, back to Europe. And the Hollywood story, the TV story doesn't start till later, but the Hollywood story does start much earlier. And it is the American film industry that captures the world. Many of the people working in it are British, Alfred Hitchcock, Cary Grant. But this is the beginning of America capturing the world's imagination. And that does change the dynamic. The cultural snobs can still say this is popular culture. This is, where's the real culture? This is all popular culture. They can't compete with Europe on high culture, though eventually I think America can compete with Europe on everything. But in popular culture terms, the early 20th century does see a real shift, I think.
And I'm not sure how strong this idea is in the interwar period, but in the 19th century, there's quite an interesting way of thinking about culture that you find in a lot of Victorian writing. Because at that point, the question is, why does Britain appear to be less culturally exciting than Italy or France or Germany? It doesn't produce the kind of great composers that the Germans do until the 20th century. It's not famous for its art in the way that the Italians are, or to a degree the French. And so a writer like Macaulay will argue that in the same way that we are at our most imaginative when we are children, and then as we kind of mature, we move into adult things and we go into business rather than drawing with our crayons. In the same way, you would expect a sort of backward people like the Italians to be more imaginative and creative and artistic than we are, because we're now doing the serious work of creating the nation's wealth. And so, to some extent, the kind of pride that you get in English culture by the end of the century and the early 20th century is also partly a recognition we are moving beyond that period of absolute economic dominance. You can't any longer say that the great thing about Britain is that it produces all of the world's machinery, or that it has the best factories in the world. So you're having to kind of re-narrate what it is that makes Britain great.
And yet, at the same time, what's becoming clear is that culture on an industrial scale, which I don't think Britain did achieve in the 19th century, is being achieved by the United States in the 20th century. So we've now, in a way, reached where we were last time, which is 1945, 46 and beyond. So the thing that we have described to this point, does it make any sense before post-Second World War period to call it a special relationship, do you think? As you've described it, there are so many dimensions to it: rivalry, emulation, fear, trepidation, inspiration, competition, all of it. But it also fits a template of Britain's relationship with other powerful nations too, other nations that it patronised, like you say, the Italians. Is there a special relationship before it's invented after the Second World War?
I think Churchill is constantly trying to speak into existence something that does not, at that point, exist, in the sense of a fraternal alliance, a sense of commonality between the English-speaking peoples, common strategic interests in the world, and a common strategic policy. What there probably is beforehand is a peculiar relationship. We've talked already about the sense that America has a place in the British political imagination, which I think is simply different to that either of the Empire or of Europe. For obvious reasons of language, it is easier to communicate with the United States, and that does matter at a time when English is not as widely spoken in other parts of the world. I think actually, oddly, Churchill coins this expression, the English-speaking peoples, at a moment at which that term is becoming less narrow than it had been in the past, because English, thanks to American cultural domination, will start to become the lingua franca of the world. But before that, there is a kind of access to American politics. Not in high society, but in radical newspapers and the working class press that would be different to that of other parts of the world.
So it's peculiar, it's not special. It's going to be called special after 1945, and many people have questioned it from then till now. Do you think it remained peculiar as well? Do you think it's more peculiar than we give it credit for in the post-war period? It's tempting, once we have the creation of NATO, once we have the Cold War, then once we have what seems like a natural affiliation between certain political leaders, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan being one example, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton being another, actually just as close in their way, that we start to over-naturalize it and forget that that historical legacy is still there, and it's still quite odd.
I think perhaps the problem with this subject is thinking of it as an it at all, as a single thing, that actually what we're talking about here are all kinds of different relationships. So there is an intelligence relationship, there is a military relationship, there is a cultural relationship, there are all sorts of forms of economic integration. And those things actually operate on different registers and move up and down in different shapes. So, for example, in the 1980s and 90s, it becomes common to talk about an Anglo-Saxon economic model, that the British economy and the American economy are more like each other than the economies of the continent. That isn't really a claim that anyone is making in the 1960s or 70s, a point at which, in lots of ways, the British economy looks more socialised than an economy like West Germany. Likewise, the military relationship is very important at moments of military stress around the world. It's much less important in what we might see as kind of times of peace. So there's a lot of talk about the special relationship dying in the 1990s because there isn't really anything that the British and Americans are fighting together for. In all sorts of ways, it reactivates after 2001 when we have the war on terror. So that relationship is perhaps stronger in the Cold War and the war on terror than it is in the periods in between them.
I think it's also true, and again, I don't know whether this is typical or atypical of the long story that we've been discussing, that if you look at the main political parties in Britain in the post-Second World War era through to the 21st century, you do get very different attitudes to the United States. There are deep Atlanticists on the Labour side in politics. There are people who continue to look to the United States for inspiration and as a model. And there is growing, not just skepticism, but loathing of the United States on the left in Britain. The Labour Party in the 1980s, in the 1983 general election, saw the election of Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn. And you wouldn't get much agreement between them about how Britain should relate to the United States. But also on the right, there have always been conservatives who weren't just condescending, but contemptuous of America, cultural conservatives in particular. And at the same time with Margaret Thatcher's and others, you get this kind of capitalist go-getting Atlanticism. Is that, again, typical of the long story? Actually, if you dug into the main political parties over the previous 150 years, 200 years, you'll always find there will be some people on the radical side for whom America is an inspiration and others for whom it is a capitalist horror, and some people on the more conservative side for whom it is a backwater, and others for whom it is an example of how we could govern ourselves.
Well, I think I said at the start that this is a relationship marked by inspiration and trepidation. And I think the balance between those things moves over time according to what's seen as the relative health of the two countries. So if we went back to the late 1820s and 30s, there is absolute horror in Britain at the figure of Andrew Jackson. British observers are mesmerised by Andrew Jackson. They just think he's utterly revolting. In the days when you could turn up at the White House and just chat with the president, there are absolutely harrowing accounts of him sitting in his chair, surrounded by a great sea of saliva, spitting out his tobacco all over the floor, talking chiefly about his bowels. They just think this is the utter degradation of politics. But there's also a sense, actually, that America is more stable in that period than Britain is. Britain in the 1830s is gripped by the reform protests, by the repeal of the Union movement in Ireland. The Chartist movement is on the rise. There's a very powerful sense that Britain actually is the country that looks like it's going to blow in this period, whereas America seems to be, however gauche, seems to be rather stable. By the time you get to the 50s and 60s, it's the United States that looks like it's going to blow, whereas Britain seems by that period to have very peaceful class relations. If we fast forward to the late 20th century, we might make a similar comparison between the 1970s and the 1990s. In the 1970s, one of the things that pushes the Conservative Party towards Europe is the sense that America is in big trouble. You've had the Watergate scandal. You've had the impeachment of a president. You've got race riots going on in American cities. You have a superpower that seems to be incapable of winning a war in Vietnam. So perhaps this isn't actually where you want to moor your boat. Your security, your well-being, your prosperity might lie actually with Europe. By the 1990s, on the other hand, there's a growing sense that Europe actually is becoming economically sclerotic, whereas America is the place that's got the burners on economically, politically, and diplomatically.
So I'm now going to ask you the question to which all of this has been leading up, which is where do you think we are now? Because, so you've said a few things along the way that has just immediately made me think of now, including your description of British horror at Andrew Jackson is not a million miles away from the way that a lot of mainstream British coverage of the Trump White House reads and feels. It's outrage, but it's outrage mixed with fascination, incredulity, a sort of ghoulish fascination often. We are in March 2026. We are recording this a few days into a new war, not yet a world war. Touch wood. Touch wood by the time this episode goes out, still not yet a world war. Talk of the special relationship is being ridiculed in the White House by the president, who has told us that our Prime Minister Keir Starmer is no Winston Churchill. Well, we can agree on that without necessarily agreeing with the sentiment behind it. No one is Winston Churchill apart from Churchill, and even he was sometimes all sorts of different things. Do you think the situation we are in now, in that long story that you've described, fits that pattern? Inspiration, trepidation, the two nations moving in sync, but also sometimes out of sync with each other, fundamentally changing the way they think about each other. Of course, in this conversation, we haven't really talked about how Americans see us. That's a conversation for another time. But I've ended with how one American sees us. Donald Trump thinks we're not to be relied on anymore. Do you think 2026 is the start of something very new? Is the end of something that was a familiar default? Or do you think it fits the pattern in that history that you've been laying out?
I think we've still got that sense, first of all, of the magnetic power of America as the example against which Britain measures itself and its politics, perhaps for slightly different reasons, just because of the kind of saturation of American culture. But still, much of our politics, I think, orbits around that question of, are you inspired by President Trump or are you appalled by him? And both of those things are true. Clearly, much of Reform UK, for example, would regard as admirable the idea of what ICE is doing or many other parts of Trump's policies.
Although, it should be said, interestingly, not many Reform voters who are as sceptical as Trump as the mainstream of the British public. So it is relatively a niche position. If we've been talking about periods where that inspiration trepidation thing is finely balanced, I'd say it's not particularly finely balanced here at the moment. It does seem skewed very heavily one way.
Yeah, and in that sense, the idea of America is always important in reshaping Britain's internal politics, because the way that people feel about reform is not going to be shaped simply by what they see reform politicians saying and doing. It's going to be shaped by the analogies that they draw with what's happening overseas. I suppose if we're thinking about what's changed, then on the one hand, this isn't the special relationship that Winston Churchill imagined in 1946. And actually, in all sorts of ways, it hasn't been for 60, 70 years. This is not a partnership between two global systems. It is about a small power economically, politically, and especially nowadays militarily, thinking about how it orbits around this much larger and increasingly self-confident global force. But I think one of the interesting things about the special relationship is that the things that hold it together are to some extent also the things that push it apart. So classically, it's held together by a common language. But a common language also means that you have immediate access to one another's politics, immediate access to each other's insults. It means that in American culture, the villain is almost always played by somebody with a British accent, that there is a kind of suspicion of British culture in America as there is of American culture in Britain. Likewise, their military interdependency is on the one hand something that holds the relationship together, but it also means when America acts, Britain comes under pressure. Britain faces the dilemma of whether to allow Diego Garcia or other military bases to be used in the bombing of Iran in a way that many other countries don't face that particular dilemma. The fact that their economies are so intertwined is a source of strength, but it also means that when Trump introduces new tariffs or reorients the American economy, that has outsized effects in the United Kingdom. So this has always been a relationship based on attraction and repulsion. And the difficulty is it is the same things that are attracting and repelling the two countries.
I'm not going to ask you to speculate what's going to happen in American politics, but in the story that you've described over 200 years, the one consistency here, right back to the beginning when the United States was a small, relatively fragile nation trying to build itself to start with on the edge of an ocean away, there was still a fascination with it. At that point, America, in the first half of the 19th century, early in the 19th century, had probably an outsized hold on the British imagination. And the fascination has persisted. The one thing that has not shifted is the fascination. People always want to know what's happening in America in a way that I'm sure there have been points where people have been fascinated by what's happening in France. They've been fascinated sometimes by what's happening in Germany. I think very rarely, even today, are they fascinated by what's happening in China. You get the first stirrings of it, I think, in the last few years, when the latest dancing robots videos appear, when people see the way that technology is being integrated into Chinese life. They are beginning to get a sense that China is the future we need to be looking to. If we want to know where the great experiment is happening and where we are heading, America is no longer it. But can you imagine that fascination waning to that extent in our lifetimes? I mean, I think we might, for the first time in 200 years, be on the cusp of a shift in the sense that if you ask me, though we don't have a shared language, so I have very little access to what's going on in China, I'm very reliant on sources that may not be reliable. I may also be subject to Chinese propaganda. I read the New York Times, and do I know better after reading the New York Times what China is really like today? I could go there, but I haven't been there for many years. But I feel like we're on the cusp for the first time in a long time where America is no longer the future, and it no longer has that grip on the imaginative future for a country like Britain in the way it has done pretty much for 200 years. Or do you think it's premature to call that?
I think it probably is premature, but I think it's certainly a possible future. One of the ironies, I think, of the Trump administration is that it has actually made our dependence on America more visible than it was 20 years ago. We are more conscious now of the extent to which our security depends upon the United States, the extent to which Europe cannot defend itself from attack. We are more conscious of the damage that the United States can do to Britain and to Europe economically through things like tariffs. Because we wake up every day, and almost the first item on the news every day is what President Trump has said, we are more conscious of this person in our lives than I suspect most of us were of President Obama or President Biden. So in that sense, America actually looms larger in our thinking, perhaps now than it did in the period of the 90s, where all sorts of things that America upheld and made possible, which is seen to be the natural state of the world. And yet, alongside that, the Trump administration is behaving in ways that are sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously pushing Britain and Europe to disengage from the United States. They're pushing it to make its security less dependent on the United States, to insulate their economies from American political pressure, to perhaps find allies and relationships in other parts of the world. And in that respect, this might be a tipping point where, by being shown our dependence on the United States, Britain and Europe start to try to dismantle that.
But you think not yet the tipping point to the extent that we would say, for many people now, the great experiment is China?
So that may be true. I think our ability to access it is still much lower for the reasons that you've described. The technologies that we use in our everyday lives, the social media on which we're principally dependent, those things are still absolutely saturated in America, in American culture and American news and American politics. Perhaps that will change in the future. But I think at the moment, we're still very much living imaginatively in an American world.
We do want to say a big thank you to everyone who has sent in messages and suggestions to this podcast. We get lots and lots. We value them all. We are a tiny team, so I'm afraid we can't reply to every message we get, but we do take note of all of the suggestions for future episodes, for topics, for ideas. We love the feedback. Do keep it coming. I'm sorry we can't reply to everybody, but thank you. Next time, we have a one-off, a special live recording of PPF in conjunction with the London Review of Books. It happened just a few days ago in London at Friend's house. I'm in conversation with Lyse Doucet from the BBC, historian Chris Clark, writer and diplomat Thant Myint-U, and we're talking about the state of democracy in historical perspective, past, present and future, but we're also talking about something that's happening at the moment, the war with Iran. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.